Hey, Warpugs. So, we're finally getting back into the Siege of Vraks. We're back on Vraks, baby! It's the Siege of Vraks, Episode 8, The Big Push, okay? I know we haven't been back here in some time with Janovich, but we're here now. You're here with me, and we're going to be here together. If this is your first time ever seeing this, the entire playlist is up. The links in the description link to the actual original playlist for this. I have been impressed with this since it first started. It's not going to stop now. He is summarizing the lore. Yes, there is some stuff being left out, but it's stuff that really doesn't hurt the feelings to be left out. You're getting there's so much lore in 40k, especially around the Siege of Vraks, that anything regarding the Siege of Vraks that doesn't last about 20 hours is Reader's Digest version. He's doing this remarkably well. The big facts are getting pushed out. The huge overview is getting pushed out. In fact, I've seen some people do entire hours worth of commentary on just the Vindicare assassin who went to take out the Cardinal Zaphrin in the first place. So I'm really enjoying this summation. And if you really wanted to get somebody in, especially from channels, if you wanted to introduce somebody to 40k that enjoys other, military-centric topics and also enjoys their, other hobbies, this will be a great way, because I know a lot of people watch Kings and Generals. I know a lot of people watch, what's that other one? It's Kings and Generals, and there's one other that does this particular style of presentation for historical events. But it meshes so well together, and it is so well done, I can only stand back and applaud. Guys, let's jump back into this. It's the big push. We're diving. Let's go.
The swift arrival and departure of the Dark Angels had almost gone unnoticed by the 88th Siege Army's leadership.
They were only there for a few days.
But when they realized what happened, they weren't exactly pleased to hear that the Astartes' lightning attack had completely destroyed the bridges and the starport without consulting High Command first. In fact, as far as they were concerned, within the larger campaign plan, the destruction of these important locations could actually be considered a setback.
They're the Dark Angels. Show up, meme, and leave.
With the planet completely blockaded from space, the starport had been of little use to the Vraxian defenders to begin with. So far, there had been no strategic benefit to attacking either the starport or the bridges. If only the Dark Angels had sought communication with the 88th Siege Army before their attack, then they could have surely assigned them a more useful objective at this time. It wouldn't be hard to imagine what kind of impact half a chapter of Space Marines could have had on the front lines. But more so than simply a wasted opportunity. For a while now, High Command had actually been entertaining the idea to eventually capture the starport and use it for themselves. Had the starport been able to fall into Imperial hands, this would potentially improve their own logistical situation significantly. However, the reason they had not yet attempted to carry out this plan was simply because they still needed to work out a good way to successfully cross the bridges first. These obvious choke points would be easily defended by the Vraxians, and even for the Death Corps it might prove too costly to overcome their defenses.
Now, when the Death Corps is telling you we're going to lose too many people for this to be a good idea, you want to shut up and listen at that point, because the Death Corps really doesn't care how many they lose, as long as they're losing those lives for a good reason. The Death Corps just don't throw their lives away for stupid reasons. They are more than happy, though, to die in their thousands for at least some good gain.
But while the starport's facilities could certainly make a useful addition to the 88th's campaign plans, it had so far not been vital to their operations, and thus for the Death Corps it had remained a low-priority target. High Command would certainly have been impressed by the Astartes' lightning assaults on these bridges, but now they were blown up and the starport laid in complete ruin. Any plans High Command may have had for these locations was now as good as useless. By now, the Dark Angels had already departed from Vraks and left the 88th Siege Army to pick up the pieces. Thus far, the campaign plans for Vraks had not gone particularly swimmingly, to say the least. But these recent events had just been the cherry on top. Lord Commander Julka was running out of time to finish the siege within the planned 12-year time frame, and he was starting to feel the increasing pressure to deliver results. If he could help it, he would not allow Supreme Command to have the impression that things were getting out of hand. But fortunately, there was good news as well.
Yay!
The new line corps with 3 regiments had arrived in full strength from Krieg, and they were ready to join the front lines.
Hey, you guys!
With more troops at his disposal than ever before, it would be now or never. As far as the Lord Commander was concerned, the limited and timid offenses of the last several years had clearly been no good. If anything, the stalemate had only gotten worse. It was clear that only an overwhelming tidal wave of attacks would be guaranteed to break the enemy's lines. What would be required was a truly large offensive, something Julka started to refer to as the Big Push. In order to achieve victory, Julka argued that the 88th Siege Army would need to unleash all of its military might at once.
This is also referred to as singing you the song of our people.
And so, with the military ingenuity that only a visionary commander like Julka could muster,
he was an idiot.
He would simply order the greatest offensive that the Skara sector had ever witnessed. But such a large-scale offensive would require a large amount of planning and preparations first. Julka's many influential relations had already granted him a whole new line corps, but he was well aware that any further requests for more regiments from Krieg would not be granted. But munitions, that was another matter entirely.
Yep.
Perhaps he could exercise his prestigious role as Lord Commander some more, and convince a few manufactorums and forge worlds to ship some extra supplies to Vraks. After all, his career and reputation was on the line, and he would not rest before he got the supplies he required to carry out his grandiose plans. The necessary war material required for the siege so far had already been extremely demanding on the supply lines, but the preparations for this big push would soon take it to its absolute limits. Every day, more and more transport ships arrived, and the logistics were pushed to their breaking point. On the surface of Vraks, munitions depots were being filled to their maximum capacity, and after the depots were too full, even bunkers and dugouts would be requisitioned for munitions storage purposes. And so, for a while, the fighting on the front lines had been suspiciously quiet as the Death Corps was busy stockpiling the required munitions, troops, and vehicles near the front lines.
By munitions, he is referring to artillery, if you didn't already know.
Day and night, endless transport columns moved over the Van Meersland wastes. This would not go unnoticed by the Vraksian defenders, however. The frantic activity of logistic transports to and from the Imperial lines had warned them of what was to come, and so the Vraksians prepared themselves for the coming storm as best they could. Within several weeks, on both sides the trenches were filled to the absolute brim with equipment and troops. Every dugout and bunker was completely packed with absolutely no room to spare. Large amounts of heavy artillery had been brought up from the rear and had already pre-sighted their targets. The artillery gunners were anxiously waiting for their firing orders. With the innumerable stockpiles of shells that had been assigned to them, it wasn't difficult to imagine the kind of hellfire that was soon about to break loose. Until finally, at 0 hour, orders were given for Lord Commander Julka's big push to officially begin. All across the line, the Death Corps artillery opened up their bombardment. An absolutely monumental amount of shells flew over no man's land and started raining down on the enemy's front lines. In turn, the Vraksian gunners unleashed their barrage. All over the front, the ground was shaking from the enormous amount of shells exploding everywhere. Then, the whistles blew, and all along the Death Corps trenches, troops started making their way up the ladders.
Yay!
With fierce determination in their hearts, they clung to their las guns and rushed out of their trenches as they made their way over no man's land. The defenders would not hesitate for a second. Their pre-sighted artillery opened up in response and covered the advancing infantry in a rain of shrapnel. But the brave soldiers of the Death Corps marched on through the fire towards their deaths. If anything, this momentous attack would be their chance for redemption. This assault would go on for several days. At some places, small gains were achieved, while in many others, entire squads were wiped out before they even got out of the trenches. All the while, the deafening crescendo of artillery fire from both sides never stopped. By now, thick smoke covered almost the entire battlefield. Disfigured corpses littered the ground everywhere. Trenches and bunkers were blown into ruins, burying both the Death Corps and the Vraksians with them. This battle was of an intensity not witnessed on Vraks before, and eventually this insane maelstrom of battle would prove too much for even the usually undaunting soldiers of Krieg. In several places, the carnage had been so intense that some squads had begun to disobey High Command's orders, and they abandoned their assaults.
I said that Zolka was incompetent. At the beginning of this, I said it, I'll say it again and again and again and again. Zolka was absolutely incompetent. And this is the result. You have Kriegers saying that you're wasting their lives needlessly.
For the first time in the entire 9-year-long siege, the Death Corps of Krieg wavered. Commissars tried exercising their authority to keep the troops in line, but it wasn't enough. In some places, the retreating troops even killed the commissar standing in their way to reach safety. The 158th Regiment had even retreated all the way back to their own lines completely. Such cowardly insubordination could not be tolerated, and local regimental command staff were arrested and executed for their abject failures, and the regiment disbanded. Wherever the Death Corps achieved their objectives, Vraksian counterattacks were at the ready to make sure their enemies' gains were short-lived. For days, attacks going back and forth would continue, and although the Vraksians paid almost as heavy a price as the Death Corps did, they managed to hold the line. So after 7 days of fighting, still no breakthrough had come. The initial rush of battle was slowly petering out as weapon and munition stockpiles were starting to run dry. The artillery had continued firing day and night, and finally the shells were about to be depleted. But Colonel Atas, an experienced veteran in command of the 468th Regiment, would give it one last try. He knew the 88th Siege Army was reaching the point of exhaustion, but so was his enemy. He thought he knew a place of weakness in the Vraksian lines that could be exploited, if only he had the right composition of troops available to him. But if he had asked permission beforehand, High Command would never have allowed his complex and risky plans of attack.
And that's why this guy is a terrible, terrible Krieger.
So in violation of standard siege doctrine, and without strict permission, Colonel Atas had already started gathering up a rather specialized strike force. He used his reputation and relations within the ranks to requisition an extra artillery piece or tank here and there. With stockpiles running low, munitions were especially hard to come by. But relying on several favors from his direct colleagues, he actually managed to scrape together the troops and equipment needed to carry out his plans. He picked his best men and equipped them with the best gear and weapons he had at his disposal. Then under the cover of night, he led them forward, crawling through the mud and underneath the barbed wire as close to the enemy lines as possible. The bolstered artillery under his command opened up a bombardment and concentrated their fire on a very localized piece of the front lines, where Colonel Atas had estimated the potential weakness. When the bombardment stopped, he ordered his troops to rush forward and assault the enemy defenses. Colonel Atas had been right. This was indeed a weak spot. The prolonged fighting had shook and worn out the defenders, but more importantly, almost all of their heavy weapons had already been destroyed.
Hoorah!
The final, heavily concentrated bombardment, orchestrated by Colonel Atos, was the thing that finally broke their will to fight. When the well-equipped troops of the 468th Regiment jumped into the trenches of the Vraksians, rather than putting up a fight, most of them fled before them. And so, the position could be captured with limited casualties. Colonel Atos signaled his waiting mechanized troops to come forward as well, to establish the breakthrough for good. He would have enough troops left to hold against any counterattack. He contacted High Command that a breakthrough had been established at Sector 57-50. While they were surprised to hear of this unexpected success, they nevertheless quickly prepared to send in the assault corps and Death Riders to exploit the gap in the enemy's lines.
There you go.
Despite the success, Atos knew that when all of this was over, he would be called in for interrogation and would have to explain why he had acted on his own without orders. He would be lucky if he only received a demotion. But he wouldn't have much time to ponder over his further career. Amongst the last remnants of defenders, a huge and bewildered Vraksian Ogren rampaged through the trench lines. The enraged abhuman monster was being shot by lasguns from all sides, but would not be stopped. Colonel Atos, unfortunately, found himself in its way, and was forcefully smacked aside by the Ogren's sledgehammer, shattering his ribcage into splinters. His broken body flew 6 meters through the air before landing on the ground. Eventually, the Ogren was taken out by several crack grenades that blew it apart. But the Colonel...
The fact that traitors get access to Ogrens really annoys me, because the Ogrens should be good boys.
Was already dead. He had been instantly killed by the powerful blow. Just as with the first breakthrough of Fort A453, almost 8 years ago, the mechanized forces of the Death Corps started rolling up the rear of the Vraksian lines, forcing them to retreat back to their final defensive line. This time, the withdrawal would not be as organized as before, but then again, there wasn't much to be taken back to the inner defensive lines either. The intense fighting had severely drained the Vraksian fighting force, and not much equipment could be salvaged to begin with. Scattered remains of survivors, artillery, and mechanized troops made their way over the Van Meersland wastes. And only in the areas surrounding Heb Zones 2 and 3 did they put up any kind of rearguard resistance at all. But the big push had taken an even heavier toll on the 88th Siege Army.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm not going to go on.
More than 1 million infantry soldiers had lost their lives assaulting the Vraksian defenses, and the barrels of the artillery were all but worn out. Right now, the siege regiments were in no state to pursue and keep pressure on their retreating foes. They were simply too damaged to engage in another offensive against strong defensive lines. It would take time to build the army back up to its original fighting strength. But overall, it seemed that the end of the siege was in sight. The 88th Siege Army would perform its encirclement of the inner defensive lines, and the citadel would finally come in range of their heavy artillery. Now it was only a matter of time before the Vraksians would surrender. Julka could rest easy again. With a successful assault, surely he had proven himself worthy of his title as Lord Commander. But Vraksian leadership was not nearly as desperate as the Death Corps anticipated. Lord Arkos had by now assumed his role as trusted advisor to the Cardinal. The false Emperor's armies might be tightening their noose around Vraks, but Arkos's assurances of an eventual victory had easily manipulated Zafan's mind. Many allies would be ready and willing to assist the Cardinal if he stayed resolute and fought on, and most of all, listened to Arkos's advice.
Oh yes, definitely.
This faint glimmer of hope was all Zafan needed to accept whatever the Alpha Legion commander proposed. But Arkos's promises had not just been empty lies. In fact, he would set his sorcerers to work and begin the ceremony that would call for reinforcements to come to Vraks. Unbeknownst to either the Cardinal or Lord Commander Julka, the immense bloodshed and carnage of the Big Push had provided the required human sacrifice that now fueled the dark rituals Arcos had ordered to be performed.
Hooray!
Before all of this, Vraks had merely been a large battleground of little importance, but with so many humans slaughtered and their souls sent to the warp, now it was starting to draw the attention of the Chaos Gods. Before long, the Death Corps troops in the front lines started reporting strangely colored storm clouds hanging in the sky above the citadel.
Yay!
Some of the more superstitious guardsmen would even say it took the shape of a demonic head at times. Julka's big push had already produced destruction on a scale not witnessed before, but things were certainly about to get a lot worse.
Yep.
But only the Alpha Legion had a true understanding of what was about to unfold. For the strange cloud formation was not simply the result of some curious weather on Vraks. It was in fact a beacon, and soon it would draw many followers of chaos towards Vraks, like moths to a flame.
Julka embodied the concept of throw bodies at it until it stops being a problem. That was Julka's biggest problem. And it was on firm display during the big push. I can't remember. It's going to come up soon. But the sheer fact of the matter was, Julka was not someone who should have been put in charge of this. He really should not have been put in charge of this whatsoever. It's actually kind of a bad sign that he was... This was typical of Lord Commanders. They would typically be way off world. But it was a really bad sign that not once in the length of time up until this point had he been to Vraks actual. He had not been to the planet yet. At all. He was staying on the Ration Primaris, just chilling out, eating grapes, and getting fatter. I don't like Julka too much, in case you guys did not notice. Julka is to Lord Commanders what Hermann von Straub was to planetary governors. And if you know anything about me, I hate Hermann von Straub about twice as much as I hate Julka. But that's still way too much. Guys, we're going to be checking out the Void Battle of Vraks, which is the next episode in the list. We'll be checking that out soon. I'm glad to be back on this. I know that he is currently still making these. I can't wait until we get to certain parts of this lore story. And if this is your first time experiencing Vraks, then you picked a damn good person to learn it from. All that being considered, as per usual, guys, all the Janovich links are going to be in the description down below, right next to my own. I highly, highly, highly recommend his channel for everything else he's done, including the animated Vraks trailer that he did, which was excellent. Actually, yeah. I will see you guys next time. And just remember, don't ever question the Inquisition when it comes to this kind of thing. And I'm surprised, after what wound up happening later on in this, you're going to be surprised that the whole planet wasn't glassed. Just saying.